If you have a loan, personal loan, and it has been current on until March 2nd, and you are getting difficulties, particularly because of the pandemic, directly or indirectly, you can go to your bank and they can discuss with you extending it in various ways, including, as if at all the personal circumstances allow, could be even a sense of a moratorium. But the point is that it can be extended up to.
Welcome back. You're watching Transform Kenya. And that bite from the Central Bank Governor, Dr. Patrick Njoroge, sets the tone for our next area of discussion. And let me start off with Dr. David Ndii. Well, this proposal is seen as very critical when it comes to cushioning Kenyans with loans. This touches on the salaried people and the SMEs. Is it a viable option, and how long can it last?
Yes, absolutely. Financial relief was one of the first sort of steps that was required. In fact, I recall my first comment on this, which is now more than a month ago, was to point out that the traditional policy instruments for dealing with shocks, fiscal and monetary policy, were not fit for purpose. They were not going to work. And I said, government has already done financial relief, and that's a good thing. And then in addition to financial relief, I proposed two things. One is what I called a lifeline to protect businesses and jobs. And the second one is a community social safety net. And I'll tell you why I said that. Because the question which I was dealing with is, what are the instruments for trying to provide this relief and to replace the incomes so as to provide a floor so that the economy doesn't go through the bottom? And many of the issues people are raising, how do you reach SMEs, inform ones, and that kind of thing, and budget mechanisms and VAT, those things I had already thought them through. And I said, I know how policy works. I know the transition mechanism. Those mechanisms are going to work. So this is what I said we think we should do. The money that the government was going to borrow and put in development projects, it should continue to borrow that money, but that money should not leave the banks. The government should then tell the banks, lend this money to businesses, and employees and workers to replace their lost income, interest-free, with a very long grace period. I was suggesting at least 6 months to a year. And then they can repay over a very long period, maybe 5 years. That's why I was calling it a lifeline fund. It's actually a policy instrument. Because I appreciated, I was quite alive to the fact that the policy instruments we are trying to use will not work. They're not the right instruments. And that's what that was long before the Western government started doing the same thing. But I'm an economist, so I can think through these things. The second thing was said, look, in addition to that, you need a community level safety nets for people who are not in the formal system. And I propose that be done by way of grants at the ward level. And I already calculated that it would not be too much money because we have 1,500 wards. And if you're talking about the most vulnerable, I did some math and said it would come to about 3 million a month on average per ward, times 1,500 wards is about 4.5 billion shillings a month. And that, I think, would be sufficient to provide a community level safety net for the sort of people in the very informal and resource poor farmers and other people. I think what has not been appreciated is that, look, the things we are doing with money in the budget are not the priority right now. And the government was going to borrow this money anyway. let the government borrow this money and we convert it into a war chest to protect the economy the best way we can from COVID.
All right, allow me to interject.
I think that has been very difficult to communicate.
Daktari, allow me to interject on your point. Are you also implying that if the existing loans that Kenyans have, you have approached your bank, you've asked for some more time to be paying your loan, the time elapses and you've not yet cleared, and yet you're still proposing that we borrow as a government to still give banks money to lend to people? Wouldn't this be chaotic?
Listen, I think you need to, the government has planned to borrow, government has already borrowed 400 billion shillings from the domestic market this year. It was planning to borrow another 200 billion by the end of the financial year. I am saying go ahead and borrow it.
Okay, Daktari.
Because it was already planned.
Okay, Daktari, you've made your point.
Put it in projects.
Okay, I get it.
Make it soft loans to protect the economy. So it's expenditure switching. There's nothing new.
Daktari, let's get Victor to also weigh in on this. Is this a practical solution, Victor? Soft loans in this day and time where we already have people with existing loans?
I think just speaking from the SME perspective, as I keep on mentioning, 79% of SMEs are in the informal, unlicensed, and maybe probably are not registered, are in the informal economy. So the question that I'm calling, or I'm trying to ask all of us is, and probably this is something that we've done, is can we conduct a mapping exercise of all these SMEs in the informal sector, all of which belong to either a chama, a SACCO, or a saving groups of some sort. And of course, some these entities are either in banks, if you go to cooperative, if you go to KCB, if you go to NGOs, if you go to civil society, you'll find a lot of these informal sector players aggregating into these chamas. And once we identify and map out all these associations across board, then we can use that as a channel to give any stimulus or give whatever package. For me, I think if you're to look at a common mama mboga sitting somewhere in Kawangware, if you're to give them 10,000 shillings as a loan, remember these guys are already cash strapped. What they will do basically is they'll take that money and use it for their daily needs. So I think for me is we need to have a balance in terms of giving them the same 10,000 shillings. Half of it, maybe I propose, would be a grant, and half of it should be in form of a loan. So the 5,000 that acts as a grant becomes the safety net that Dr. Ndi is talking about, to ensure that at least they have money in their pocket. All
right. Honorable Kuria, if you look at our current debt as a country, we are standing at over 5.4 trillion shillings. And Dr. Ndi is still having some radical prescriptions that we borrow more so that this money can be given to Kenyans. Is this the right route to follow?
There is no right time for borrowing, and I think what drives Dr. Ndi to think about more borrowing at this time is because we have no option. Simply because we are in a fix, we're in a trap, and the fiscal space that we have cannot allow us to navigate out of this problem. I'm sure if you ask Dr. Ndi in normal times, he will not have the same kind of standpoint. So I understand where he's coming from because we are in that kind of a situation. I've offline in the past engaged Dr. Ndi about his lifeline proposal and his community proposal. And I want to tell him that, again, even the monies we're talking about, even within our very restricted fiscal space, is not money that we cannot come up with. After all, today, by just one edict, we moved 5 billion from public coffers into private fund. So that is the kind of money he's asking. So if the money that moved today, if we had listened to Dr. Ndi, it could have been the month of May for the Lifeline Fund, for example, or the Community Fund. So that is not really the issue. And we can borrow, we can use our tax-generated revenue. The issue is very simple, and I'll go back to what I said. When you go and tell an executive, start a Lifeline Fund, start a Community Fund, they will look at you, they will not give you an answer. What they are not telling you is that we have no mechanism, we have no framework. We don't have tools to be able to implement such kind of a thing much as we want. And this is something that we've seen, and let me say, because I'm a leader, I'm also guilty of it, that we have seen it, build up over time, whereby we have got zero tools. It's a year now, almost, since we closed Huduma number registration. How come now Huduma is not telling me who needs food? Because in other economies, Huduma should be the answer. So how can we justify all those Huduma numbers? Was it just for taking our biometrics and keeping it somewhere? If Huduma cannot be versatile enough to respond and tell me, in this village in Gatundu South, we have got 5 people who are needy, then it's as well as a waste. That's what I'm saying, because we can do the blame game until cows come home. Personally, and within my role as a legislator, or a member of the budget committee, I want to focus on practical, simple things that you can be able to do. Pay people on a weekly basis. That ensures that money is circulating in the economy. Let the government not depend on people.
Moses.
Just 1 minute, Abby. Why is the government saying about pending bills, and they never ask people, if you are owed money, come and report? So they depend on counties and ministries and departments and agencies to report themselves. So that should be able to look at. Pension, for example. Can we look at
time is up, Moses.
Times?
We also want to hear from the CS.
To be able to allow people to access their pension ahead of their time because of COVID. Simple things we can be able to do. Otherwise, those others of milk and honey, what they're after, they are good for theory, but they can't help us now.
All right, your point is made. And CS, the buck stops with you. Of course, this issue is very pertinent. What is your take on this input from Dr. Ndi? And actually, as we merge that, there's a question directed to you by Martin Dirangu, who is saying, how will the Lifeline Fund cater for the needs of people in the informal sector? That is the Mama Mboga, Boda Boda guys, Juakali entrepreneurs, salons, and barbershops. CS, over to you.
I think 2 things. One is to confirm that I think some of the thoughts that have come from Victor, from Dr. Ndi, from Honorable Kuria, are actually very aligned to the thinking within government. The cash transfer program has been clearly calibrated and developed to target the most vulnerable in our population. Now, the government has got lots of data on people, whether from Huduma number, whether from recently from the census, from the population, from the demographic survey. And also because of the extensive government system, it is possible to track down who communities who are the most vulnerable in our communities. I remember when I was a child, when social workers came around the village and they asked who are the poor people in the village was exactly able to identify even the most vulnerable people. And they don't all live in Nairobi, they live in different places. So as the president announced today, we would start, there's a pilot program for a weekly stipend for vulnerable families. So I think is already in place.
All right.
Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, I think Parliament is actually considering the supplementary budget. And that supplementary budget has some proposals on different expenditure items and freezing others. Some already like announced, travel has been frozen. So that money is also, Parliament is being asked to approve its reallocation to something else. So I think we're living within our means and redirecting expenses to what is inspired by COVID.
All right, thank you.
On the third question, especially on support to business, I have these 2 comments. The banks have announced and invited their clients to come and renegotiate their facilities. And we have reviewed what has happened. I think the issue is that some clients are going in. I think what we require as Kenyans and to encourage ourselves is to actually also consider borrowing for running expenses or overheads and rents and related matters, even if the business is not operating, because that facility is available so long as you have that conversation with your bank, and that's the provision that the central bank has also provided to these banks. But of course, the banks hold depositors' money. It's not free money. So they also have to act most prudentially around protecting deposits.
All right, yes.
So when it comes to the other question of SMEs, as Victor said, I think it's important to encourage SMEs through their different associations to also make sure that they are well organized. I think we reach them, but there are some who may not be part of any association, and therefore, once the design of programs to support them comes, some might not be reached because they've not been mapped, but we'll have to work together with different groups in order to reach as many people as possible.
All right, thank you, CS Betty Maina there. Well, of course, a floodgate of questions being shared on our social media platforms, from Twitter handles to our slido.com platform. But unfortunately, because of time, we might not be able to take all your questions, but this doesn't mean the conversation ends there. We can keep the conversation going on our social media platforms. Remember, our hashtag tonight is Standard Media Group, and that is Transform Kenya SG. That is our hashtag tonight. Well, and we want to wrap up the discussion this evening here on the program. We've been having a very interesting set of panelists who have been giving some prescriptions on what next for the economy, and it's not all gloom and doom. Well, we've been having there the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Trade, Industry and Enterprise Development, Betty Maina. We've also been having Dr. David Ndi, who is an economist and the MD for Africa Economics. And we also had with us Victor Otieno, who is CEO for Vifa Consult. And last but not least, we have had Honorable Moses Kuria, Member of Parliament for Gatundu South. That's why we wrap it up on Transform Kenya virtual discussion. Remember, keep it locked here on KT News. My colleague, that is none other than Akisa Wandera, is coming up next with the news for 9 p.m. My name is Abby Gina. Have a lovely evening.
Transform Kenya.